Well, how would you tell us?
Snapshots from the Citadel.
Great. Okay.
Nothing terribly consistent. I'd appreciate it, yes. Or we can show it now and then we won't have to carry it around. Yeah. This is Halifax in 1832. And you can see a number of familiar landmarks here. Here's the round church, of course. And over here is St. Paul's and the Basilica and St. Matthew's Church. And this I've not identified. Anybody identify that one for me? I don't think it's a church. Years earlier, the French had come in with 48 vessels and gone right through here and gone up into the basin to Birch Cove, and they had anchored there, and then they had taken their dead and their dying ashore because they had a terrible, terrible time, and they were wiped out. 11% of the crew died on the journey over. It took them 3 months to get from France to Halifax. They'd expected to do it in one. And they, in the wintertime, they barely survived. And D'Anville, the Duke d'Anville himself, did not survive. He died only weeks after they arrived. So that was the first European, in mass kind of contact that the locals had. But now here is another one, because as I say, there are 14 vessels and they're coming in, and they're all merchantmen. Sorry, 13 of them are. They're merchantmen. They're square riggers, and there's a dear little sloop. It's the best. This is like a terrier. It puts everybody in order. The sloop is moving in among them and getting them away from Cap over here on this side of the harbor, so we'll hit that. And it's saying to avoid what we now call Sleepy Hollow under York Redoubt, because there you lose all wind power. So he brings them in, and they do anchor inside George's Island. In fact, they all anchor right off here. Now, that's the scene. There are aboard. There are slightly over 3,000 men and women, and about another 800 hands for the ships. So you've got about 4,000 people suddenly appearing unannounced in this site. And the question is, why in the name of God are they coming here? Well, D'Anville had his purpose. This is the land that God gave him. D'Anville had his purpose. He was coming to assemble a force that would attack Annapolis Royal and retrieve it from the hands of the British. He ultimately sent 9 ships down, and they were decimated getting around beyond Yarmouth. They never did reach Annapolis Royal, so he simply turned tail. Well, his successor turned tails and said, "Oh, we're going back to France." But the British were more persistent, and partly because of the strength of the leader of the expedition, Lord Cornwallis. And Colonel Cornwallis was a man of enormous strength and power of mind. He was a man of enormous weakness of body. He had serious physical problems all through his career. He always triumphed over them, had that kind of mentality. And so what he is leading is, in fact, a unique event in British imperial history. Halifax is the only colony ever to be established directly by the British government. All other colonies were formed by people who are escaping religious persecution, or they're merchants, Walter Raleigh going for tobacco and so on. But this is the only one in which the imperial government itself does the job. And it was organized by a special branch under the Secretary of State's office called the Board of Trade. Now that's not like our Board of Trade. It's not promotional for the local merchants. The Board of Trade and Plantations. And this would be a new plantation. And so the Board of Trade sends out this, or begins to form the idea of sending this group out. And the two chief organizers, as I say, there are two. One is Lord Cornwallis, and we'll do more in a moment. He's a rising star in army circles. And the other, who's not given much attention in the history books, is a man named John Dick or Dyke, D-Y-C-K. He is Dutch. He's from Rotterdam. And in fact, he specializes, he's an entrepreneur specializing in transportation of people and goods. And he's been chosen for that kind of expertise. He's also been chosen because he's a Huguenot. Now, why is it important that he is a French Calvinist or a Dutch Calvinist in his case? Anybody know?
British are also Catholic.
Yeah, well, yes. Yeah. Because who are the inhabitants of peninsular Nova Scotia?
Yeah.
The Acadians. And so the idea was to bring a body of people out who could gradually work their way along the coast and infiltrate and ultimately intermarry with the Acadians. Because remember, the Acadians are not Quebecois, and they're proud of it. They do not want, I mean, it's still part of the mentality. They're not part of Quebecois society. They don't recognize the term New France. And indeed, they've seen every evidence that Quebec, representing the Crown, is not interested to protect their interests. They've been suffering. And so it's considered that they would be prone to being infiltrated and making their association with fellow Protestants, fellow Huguenots. And so that was one of the main reasons for bringing them out, to infiltrate. They also are chosen because they're the people, that is, who are coming, because they demonstrate loyalty to the British Crown, that was the idea. Whether that would prove true will be seen in a moment. But to go back to the Acadians also are anti-monarchist. And that is a problem they want. They want to get monarchists, Huguenot, in among them. In fact, they're so anti-monarchist that when Beaumarchais, the man who you remember wrote the libretto or the Marriage of Figaro for Mozart, Beaumarchais visited Annapolis Royal, and he got to know the Acadians. He found them thoroughly charming. His only objection was they didn't really appreciate women and wine sufficiently. But they had so many other good qualities. And so the upshot was that it was considered that well, Beaumarchais said, these are not monarchies, they are demi-républicains. They're half republicans. So again, you see, they thought it would be easy to bring the Acadians into the British orbit because they are already halfway out of the French orbit. Okay? So on March the 7th, 1749, England's Board of Trade announced by the Royal Gazette that an expedition would leave for the area known as Chipotle, and it would leave, if you can believe it, on April the 10th. March the 7th to April the 10th for a merchant, for a farmer, for a town's tradesman, to sell all they had, to take all their goods, everything out, and be aboard ship on April 10th. It's an impossible proposition. And so meantime, John Dyke is being persuaded in Rotterdam to try and round up Huguenots in France itself. But there isn't much time to get them over for that meeting. And so it seems inconceivable that we can possibly make it. Now let's look at Cornwallis, who's an interesting bloke. Now Cornwallis, here's where Cornwallis comes in. Cornwallis is a firm-minded soldier. That's all he knows is soldiering. And he has been a soldier with one of the most infamous soldiers in Britain at the time, the Duke of York, otherwise known as the Butcher of Cumberland, who was, of course, of European stock. And he has fought at his side at the Battle of Culloden, when the racial cleansing of the Highlands was taking place, and which is succeeded by the mopping up of the glens. And he was on that as well. So you can hardly expect Cornwallis to be particularly sympathetic to Mi'kmaq or anybody else if they get in his way. So I'm not excusing him. I'm trying only to explain it. This is a tough-minded man who has to be extra tough because he knows that he has this physical weakness and he has to hide it by being particularly aggressive throughout his career. And he always is. And this results in his moving up pretty quickly. But the difficulty is that he is faced with a most polyglot group when he actually gets there, the people who have come. Because the new town offered almost no promise to people who were all townsfolk. They were all townsfolk. The fact is that there wasn't a farmer among them. They were totally unfit as pioneers, and imagine farming in slate-filled Halifax. So with a war on, another group turned up as well, the half-pays. Anybody know what a half-pay is? He's an officer during the war who's been put on half-pay until he's called up again. But there is a war on. Well, why didn't all the half-pays who came on this expedition, why hadn't they been called up? Because they were considered less than competent. These are your forebears. This is where Halifax starts. And poor old Dyke was told, extend your recruiting campaign. And it's at this point that he goes into Germany and Switzerland. And that's where your people come from that area. And again, he's working with two groups. There's two elements of religious history you need to understand here. One is their Huguenots, and the other is their Erastians. They follow the ideas of Joseph Erastus of Switzerland. Ring a bell with anybody? Erastianism says that in all things, the church takes precedence. There's a Latin phrase, cuius regio, eius religio. Whatever the religion of the prince, so it is my religion. If you want to change your religion, you better move to another community under a different prince. They offer the entire cost of carrying families from Central Europe right here to Halifax, and they provide them with 3 years of subsidy, all tours, all seeds, for 3 years. So they have a much better chance. But of course, some of them are so, remember, this is the time of the agrarian revolution in Central Europe. It hasn't yet hit the turn of pounds in Britain or in Scotland, but it is in Europe, and Germans are ahead. So these people, you see, have won up, and some of them simply won't put up with where they're initially put, and they go over this hill, they go way back the other side, and they form the, quote, Deutsch or Dutch village, which is arable. Where in the 19th century, a man named Smith had an experimental farm. So that's the origins of the Dutch village.
It's Joseph Howell Drive now?
Yes, exactly. That whole area, yeah, and it's quite arable compared to what we have on the film. Yeah. So anyway, they land here in 1752. You see, there's 3 years after the founding, so they're not coming in quickly, and they were warehoused in effect. The authorities weren't even ready for them yet, and they warehoused them on little muddy lanes that they'd send a couple of horses up with a rake, and they called one lane Gutchington Street and the other Bloodstick Street, and that's where they were first settled, on those 2 funny little lanes. And they set them up with a little tiny church, which we call the Old Dutch Church, and you will see some of the original tombstones there. Now, Cornwallis finally gave up. He couldn't handle it. It was too much for his health. And he went home, and he was succeeded by the man who had been his lieutenant, a man whose name was Peregrine Thomas Hobson. He only stayed about 2 years, but he proved himself worth his weight in gold. He was really just another good civil servant. But given leadership, he took it. And he was the one who arranged the organization of the Germans into 3 groups. One would go to Lunenburg town, one would go to Mahone Bay, and one would go to Citadel. And that's why you get the little dukes in Citadel, and the buyers in Citadel, and so on. They all come from that same group. But the largest group, of course, lived are at Lunenburg and at Mahone Bay. And those who are from Mahone Bay tend more to have come from French-speaking areas of Switzerland. Those who come from the other come from Germany or German sections of Switzerland. They're brilliant in their accommodation. But on the other hand, they will remain loyal to Britain. They could not vote for 7 years. So they're completely dependent on Halifax holding them in their pocket. Well, now, meantime, Cornwallis was responding to the French-incited Mi'kmaq, and they were. The French were certainly inciting the Mi'kmaq to attacks, and there were minor attacks. And of course, there was the so-called massacre of Dartmouth and so on. But Cornwallis comes out, and it is true. Daniel Paul tells us that he did proclaim that you should have the right of scalping and so on. And indeed, Cornwallis did authorize the scalping of several men. So he earned a bad name. I'm not going to defend him. I don't think we should be changing the names of buildings because of it. But he was a bad man in that sense. But then, after all, what the hell would you expect of somebody who was mopping up the Glens a few years back? Didn't think of anything else but racial cleansing of the Highlands. Governor Hopson, who succeeded him, tried much harder, and he settled a treaty giving the natives hunting rights, and that improved, and he generally improved relations with the basin. But this comes back to what kind of a man Cornwallis was, and his association with Vauban, the great believer in citadels. And so he decided, no, I want it on the slopes of this hill, which, by the way, was 35 feet higher then than it is. In 1869, they took 35 feet off the top of the citadel in order to build a much bigger fortress than they could otherwise. But unfortunately, in 18th century terms, it wasn't much good to build a citadel up there and mount artillery, because the artillery were so weak, they couldn't have hit Point Pleasant Harbor, let alone a vessel coming in the harbor. So, therefore, he had to go elsewhere as well. And so he began to build up other forts and citadels. And we think of Halifax as a naval outpost, but the fact is it's highly militarized. And by the 60s, there was a chain of forts underway. Fort Massey was one. Why? Anybody know why there was a fort at Fort Massey? Because at that point, this whole area behind us in the Commons was a swamp, and it all flowed over and became the duck pond in the public gardens 2 centuries later. And then it flowed down, and you know all the construction they're doing around Fenwick now, what they're doing is cleaning up old Freshwater Creek from the 1750s. It dropped, by the way, right where it dropped into the ocean, right where Pier 21 is. So it flowed from here, right across the town, and right down there. So that was to protect the fresh water supply for the town. So Fort Massey is built. Yeah.
So presumably the main draw to this area was the harbor.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. It's all harbor. Yeah. But as I say, then we have to protect it.
Yeah.
So they start this series of so that's the first one. Then they build several batteries around Point Pleasant Park. Ultimately, in the 19th century, they built Fort Edward, which is the round one that you see there. And they also built one over protecting the Arm in the park. And they also built on George's Island, and they built one on McNabb's Island that was called Fort Charlotte. And they built one at Bedford called Fort Sackville, right at the mouth of the Sackville River. And then years later, in 1793, another 30 years, they built one at York Redoubt. And by this time, they've got cannon that can handle it, and they know that the ships that are coming in have too, so they have to mount heavy guns out there. They actually had the original guns at Fort Redoubt there in 1939. They took two 12-inch out, they left two 6-inch in. And they were all 19th century 6-inch, but they would have cleaned up any sub. So they left them there. Well then, in the 1780s, in a later war with France, it's nothing but war with France, of course, till you get into before the modern era. And of course, during the War of 1812, which Central Canada will sell for free at our expense under the present Prime Minister. It's their war, not ours. Government provided a new battery at Chain Rock, which, now, does anybody know where Chain Rock is? That's where the polar bear swim often takes place. Just as you enter the park, on
Yes,
the other
yeah.
side, right? You go way down past Pine Hill, and you go right down almost to the shoreline, and you can take a shortcut in between two houses, and you will find Chain Rock right there. Does anybody know what Chain Rock stands for? What's the significance of it? Precisely. It's called a slab raid in Gaelic. A slab raid is a floating barrier. And so if you go down there and and do as I've done, part the bushes enough, you will find two large eyeballs still in the rocks there. And those were those eyeballs that were attached and went right across the arm, and you will find similar on the other side. And they were all designed by my wife's great-great-great-grandfather, whose name was Rod McKay, and he was a Scottish armourer, and he came on the Hector, and he came down from Pictou, and he was the chief of the armament shop at the Naval Dockyard. And he was told to design and build some way of protecting the Northwest Arm. So that was used right down to the end of the War of 1812. And everything was again after that. So that's another aspect of being concerned about preserving the place.
Did the chain ever catch up the ship, or did people just stay off if they knew it was there?
You wouldn't have gone up against the chain that Rob McKay, Rob McKay is the kind of man, if he swatted a fly, you'd have to get the plasterer. Now, for some time then, what you've got is, after the founding of Halifax, is a provincial capital for which there's no province. The province is virtually empty. And so what you get then, instead, is the replica of London itself. And it starts with the most obvious landmark. What would be the most obvious landmark you would build if you wanted to replace London, England?
Big Ben.
Hey?
Big Ben, yeah.
Well, yeah, but that's not in the 18th century. What was there in the 18th century that didn't even survive the Great Fire of 1665?
Oh, the church.
St. Paul's.
St. Paul's, yeah.
So what will you call your church? St. Paul's. And you'll build a great parade beside it, as an evidence of it. And there at St. Paul's, the Sunday scene would be as follows. At 10 o'clock, everyone would come out in their finery with their laces and their high silver-tipped canes up above this men. And they'd walk proudly around the huge grand parade. And at a certain bell, they would cross the street and file in to their paid-for pews in St. Paul's. But they also wanted to remain friendly with other merchants, because this is a merchantocracy that's now dominating the place. So if you're Presbyterian, or more likely, you're Congregationalist because you come from New England and you were a merchant, but you don't want to be Anglican, but you still haven't had time to get your own church built, then the Anglicans will kindly defer to you. So you see what I mean? What you've got is a class-dominant society, very aware of its imperial and its class position. And they share that, even though they may differ on religious aspects. It's only later that they build a church. They build it not where it is today, St. Matthew's, but down on Granville Street. And it's not till the 1830s that it assumes the name St. Matthew's, and the Presbyterian Church takes it over. But from 1812 till 1830, you could have a minister there you could have a congregation there who were Congregationalists, etc. But the minister must be the minister of the Kirk, of the Church of Scotland. So you've got the established Church of St. Matthew's and the established Church of England in St. Paul's, symbolized, you see. And that's what I mean about this interwoven merchantocracy that takes over the town. But then you see, it starts to act as a sort of imperium in imperio, because it regards itself as London does to it, so it does to Pictou, to Yarmouth, and to everyone else. And so it becomes the imperial center. So you've got two kinds of imperial mentality both working at the same time. And there's a few ructions that develop out of that.